Story number 1. Santa Claus and the Haunted House. 2000s. A small rural town. I'll be honest, it didn't start off like one of those stories you tell around a campfire. No, at first, it was just a bunch of us. Young and stupid, full of that reckless energy you get when you're 18. The kind that makes you think you're invincible. You know what I mean? The nights when you think you can do anything. Even if it's something as ridiculous as spending Christmas Eve in a house that's been abandoned for years, just because it seemed like a cool idea at the time. But now, thinking back, I know how foolish we were. It was December 24th, 2003. A biting chill had settled over our small town. One of those nights where the air is so cold you can feel it burn in your chest when you breathe. The streets were eerily quiet, almost as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It had snowed heavily the night before, blanketing everything in a thick layer of white. The trees were bare, their limbs like skeletal fingers reaching toward the dark sky. We were all huddled in my car, parked at the end of the long dirt road leading up to the house. Four of us, me, Sarah, Jake, and Amy, had decided to head to this old, abandoned house just outside of town. It wasn't a house anyone really talked about, except in whispers. You see, people around here believed that something terrible had happened in that house. Something that still hung over it like a cloud of dust and despair. But it was Christmas, and we were young. What better way to spend the night than in an old, haunted house, right? It was supposed to be an adventure, a break from the usual boring Christmas nonsense. No family, no presents, no church service, just us, a few beers, and the thrill of being where we shouldn't be. The house itself was a crumbling relic of another time. You could see it even from a distance, perched on the edge of the woods like some forgotten monument to the past. It had been abandoned for as long as any of us could remember. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The chimney, once a proud feature, was now little more than a jagged wound in the stone. "I don't know about this," Sarah said as we got out of the car. Her voice trembled, but she was always the cautious one, the one who would make sure to check the locks on the doors 3 times before leaving the house. "Come on, Sarah, it's just a house," I replied, laughing. "What's the worst that could happen?" Jake, ever the troublemaker, grinned and handed me a flashlight. "If anything, it'll make a hell of a story." We walked up the cracked stone steps, our feet crunching in the snow. The air was still, too still, as if the world was holding its breath. When we reached the door, I turned the old brass handle, surprised when it gave way with a creak. The smell hit us as soon as we stepped inside, stale, musty, and damp, like something had died in the walls long ago. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the once white paint now yellowed with age. The furniture, if you could call it that, was still here, chairs upturned, a sofa with rips in the fabric, and a dusty old dining table covered in remnants of old newspapers. We spread out, wandering around the dusty rooms, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the dark corners. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by our footsteps and the occasional laugh or nervous whisper. Then, it happened. We were in the back room, the one with the cracked window looking out over the woods. When we heard the noise, at first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like something, or someone, moving in the other room. "Did you hear that?" Amy whispered, her eyes wide. "Probably just a rat," I said, though I didn't feel so sure myself. We were standing near the hallway that led to the front door when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and measured. They weren't ours. I was about to suggest we head out when I saw him. A man? No. It wasn't a man. It was him. He was wearing the outfit, the red suit, the white beard, the unmistakable look of Santa Claus. But this was no jolly, cheerful Santa. No, his eyes were cold, too cold, and his movements stiff, robotic, as if he weren't even really there, but just walking. "Hello there," he said, his voice low and grating. It sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, my hand clutching the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. He stepped forward, his boots making a hollow thud on the wooden floor as he crossed into the dimly lit room. The others must have seen him too because I heard Sarah gasp. And Amy whispered, "What is he doing here?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at us, his eyes wide and unblinking. His smile, if you could call it that, was empty, like something stitched into his face. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I couldn't move. I felt like I was trapped in some terrible nightmare, one where I couldn't wake up. Before I could react, he took a step toward the door, and then, just like that, he was gone, disappearing into the night. We stood there, breathing heavily, the silence now deafening. "What the hell was that?" Jake asked, his voice shaky, as if he couldn't believe what we had just seen. That wasn't a joke. He was real. Sarah was already reaching for the door. "We need to leave. Now." But as we turned to go, something caught my eye, a small piece of paper wedged between the crack in the floorboards. I bent down and pulled it free. It was old, yellowed with age, and torn at the edges. I opened it, and my stomach dropped. It was a news article, dated December 24th, 2002. It was about the house, and the man who had lived here. His name was Henry Fitz, and he had been convicted of a series of brutal murders, women, children, families. He had been arrested on Christmas Eve, the very night we had decided to come here. The article went on to describe how he had been caught by the police after a bloody rampage through the house. But there was something in the last paragraph that made my blood run cold. Reports say that on the night of his capture, he was seen dressed as Santa Claus, as if mocking the holiday itself. The authorities have not been able to explain the strange events that followed his arrest. Witnesses claim they saw his figure in the house long after his capture, standing in the windows, staring out at the empty streets. We didn't stay long after that. We bolted out of the house like our lives depended on it, running through the snow until we reached the car. But even after we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following us, someone who wasn't quite human. A week later, we found out that the house had burned down. No one knows how, but they said they could hear strange noises coming from the house before the fire started. The fire department couldn't find the source. The thing is, I still see him. Every Christmas, I'll catch a glimpse of him on a street corner, standing in the shadows, wearing that same red suit. His eyes never leave mine, and I wonder, was he ever really gone? Story number 2. The Horrible Encounter with Santa Claus. 1990s. London. It was one of those cold December nights in London. The kind where the air feels so sharp it stings your lungs with each breath you take. The fog rolled in from the Thames, thick and damp, settling over the city like a second skin. The city was alive with lights, garlands draped over buildings, and the faint sound of carolers from a distance. But it was the kind of Christmas Eve that felt off. I don't know how to explain it, but everything felt different that night. The air had that electric feeling, like something was on the verge of happening, something bad. My name is David Porter, and at the time, I was living in a cramped flat in the heart of London. I had just finished up a late night at the office. No festive cheer for me. Just the sound of my typewriter keys clicking away as I tried to finish up an article for the local newspaper. By the time I stepped out into the freezing cold streets, it was nearly midnight. I didn't expect anyone to be out at that hour, let alone anyone with a cheery disposition. Yet, there he was, standing in the middle of the street. Santa Claus. At first, I thought it was just some man dressed in a red suit, one of those cheery, overzealous types who likes to get into the Christmas spirit. But as I drew closer, something about him didn't sit right. He was standing on the corner, just outside a small convenience store that was about to close. The dim light from the shop window flickered, casting odd shadows over his face. His beard was thick, too thick, and his eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes. They were dead, empty. They didn't sparkle with holiday cheer, like you'd expect from a Santa Claus. Instead, they were the eyes of someone who'd seen far too much. someone who had been hollowed out from the inside. Strange. But I remember thinking to myself at the time, I should keep walking. Something's wrong. Yet, instead of walking away, I found myself stopping in front of him. He was carrying a large sack over his shoulder, so large. I couldn't imagine how it had been packed. It was bulging in odd places, like there were things inside that didn't belong. I don't know why I didn't turn around and leave then. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange feeling in the air. Or maybe it was the way he looked at me, his eyes piercing, searching. He must have known I was conflicted, because he smiled. But it wasn't a kind smile. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and raspy. It didn't sound right. It didn't sound human. "Could you help me for a moment?" I didn't even think about it. I nodded, stepping closer, perhaps too eager to prove myself helpful, or too desperate to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. He handed me the large sack, and for a brief moment, I wondered how he could hold something so heavy. The sack was oddly warm, as though it had been sitting by a fire for hours. I didn't think anything of it at first, but then, I felt it, the chill. It wasn't from the cold night air. It was from him, from the sack. The temperature dropped as soon as I touched it, so suddenly that I gasped. The chill wasn't just a physical sensation. It went deeper than that, settled in my bones. A deep, aching cold that I couldn't shake off. I wanted to drop the sack, to run away, but I couldn't. I looked up at him, and his smile had grown wider, far too wide, the edges of his lips pulling back to reveal teeth that were far too sharp. "Thank you," he said, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. "You can go now." I should have walked away then. I should have let go of the sack, turned, and fled. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, staring at him, and that's when I saw it. In his other hand, hidden by the folds of his coat, was a long, thin knife. It was dark, but I could see the reflection of the dim streetlight dancing off the blade, catching my attention just enough to make my heart skip a beat. Before I could react, I pulled my hand away from the sack. But as soon as I did, a strange sound filled the air, a low, guttural laugh. It wasn't his. It was something deeper, something darker, like the sound of a creature that hadn't had its fill in years. That's when I finally noticed it. The smell. It was faint at first, like something musty and damp, but then it hit me with full force. It smelled like death, like decay and old bones. "Good night, David," the man said, his voice growing quieter, almost a whisper now. I didn't answer him. I didn't need to, because at that moment, I felt it, the press of cold air, suffocating and thick, rushing out from his body like a gust of wind. It was as if he wasn't even human anymore. He was something else, something far older, a shadow that had taken on the form of the jolly old man we all knew and loved. Without saying another word, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the fog. But as he did, I heard the most disturbing sound of all, a soft, almost mocking laugh that echoed behind me. It was faint, but it seemed to come from everywhere. It was the sound of someone or something laughing at my expense. I stood there for a long time, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But it didn't make sense. It didn't fit into any world I knew. The next few days, I tried to forget about it. I convinced myself that it was nothing more than a bizarre encounter. Some crazy man with a warped sense of humor. But that night, Christmas Eve, something changed. It wasn't just the strange encounter that haunted me. It was what happened afterward. Every year, without fail, I could feel him watching me. That's the worst part of all. Each Christmas, when the streets grow quiet, when the snow falls and the lights flicker on, I feel it, those eyes on me, cold and unblinking, that laugh in the distance, faint but unmistakable. It never goes away. I've moved several times since then, left London, gone across the country, but he always finds me, always, and as each Christmas Eve approaches, I know I'll hear his laugh again, and I know that, somewhere out there, the man dressed as Santa Claus is waiting for me, waiting to remind me that I'll never escape him. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder, what was in that sack? I don't want to know. Story number 3. The Children and the Santa Claus. 1950s. There's something about Christmas that doesn't sit right with me. Maybe it's because of what happened that night in 1953. A night that changed everything I believed about this holiday. We were just a simple family, living in a quiet, isolated village in northern Maine. The kind of place where everyone knows your name, your dog's name, and probably where you hang your laundry. Nothing ever really happens here. Not in the way big cities like Boston or New York have their hustle and bustle. Our world was small, serene, and safe, or at least, that's what we thought. It all started on Christmas Eve. As it always does, the house was cozy, warmth from the crackling fire mixing with the aroma of cinnamon and pine. The snow outside was coming down thick and fast, like the world was being wrapped in a blanket of white. I remember the sound of the wind howling against the windows, the kind of wind that made you feel small, like the earth was breathing too hard. We, my younger sister Clara, my little brother Jimmy, and I sat in front of the fireplace, eagerly awaiting the arrival of Santa Claus. My parents were busy in the kitchen, preparing for our Christmas dinner. The clinking of pots and pans muffled by the storm. We'd heard the stories, of course, the ones that everyone in the village whispered about on cold nights, the ones that had been passed down from one generation to the next, like a dirty secret. I don't know why I thought it would be different that year, but I did. Maybe it was the way the fire flickered, or the way the snow fell like a shroud over the world. Maybe it was just the strange feeling that clung to the air that night. We were all looking out the window when we saw him. I can still picture it in my mind, as clear as the day it happened. The figure, standing in our backyard, barely visible against the storm. At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind, the snow playing tricks on my eyes. But no. There he was, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit of red, the thick, scraggly beard hanging from his face, and a black belt that seemed too tight for his girth. Santa Claus, or so we thought. He stood there, motionless, staring into the house. His eyes, those eyes, I'll never forget them. They weren't the warm, twinkling eyes that we'd been told about in every story. They were cold, cold like the ice that built up around the window. His gaze was unblinking, almost unnatural, like he was watching us not with kindness, but with an intent that chilled my bones. He didn't move. He didn't wave. He just stared. It was like he was studying us, waiting. I remember Clara tugging at my sleeve, whispering with a voice that trembled, "Is that really him?" I don't know," I said, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. Something felt wrong. I didn't know what it was, but I knew deep down that whatever it wasn't good. We stared at him for what seemed like an eternity, the wind howling louder, drowning out the sound of our breaths. My heart pounded in my chest, and Jimmy, too young to understand, kept asking, "Is it time for presents yet?" Then, without warning, the figure moved, slowly, like he was calculating every step. I don't know who screamed first. Maybe it was me, maybe it was Clara, but we all bolted from the window, running toward the living room, where our parents were still preparing dinner. We burst into the kitchen, gasping for breath, trying to explain what we'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the air itself had been sucked from our lungs. "Mom! Dad! Santa, he's outside!" Clara cried, her eyes wide with terror. But my parents, Dad, with his usually calm demeanor, and Mom, who was always so practical, looked at each other in confusion. "What are you talking about, kids? It's just the storm," Dad said, ruffling our hair. No, there's someone out there." I tried to explain, pointing toward the back door, but my words sounded hollow, as if the storm outside had swallowed them. But we insisted, begging them to look. So, finally, Dad put on his coat, grabbed a lantern, and went out into the storm. We crowded at the door, peering through the glass as the wind howled outside. We watched him walk toward the backyard, the lantern's flickering light barely cutting through the swirling snow. But when he reached the spot where the figure had been standing, there was nothing. No footprints in the snow, no trace of a person, just the swirling wind and the empty yard. Dad called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. But there was no answer. He came back inside, shaking his head. Nothing out there. Kids, you must have imagined it. But I knew we hadn't imagined it. That night, couldn't sleep. Neither could Clara or Jimmy. We all stayed in the same room, huddled together in our blankets, too scared to close our eyes. I kept hearing that soft, sinister chuckle in my head, the one I had imagined when I saw those cold, unblinking eyes. I should have felt safe. I should have felt protected in the warmth of the house. But I didn't. Something was wrong. Something wasn't right. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the Santa Claus we had seen wasn't the real Santa. The next morning, the world was still and silent. The snow had stopped falling, and the sun came up pale and weak, casting long shadows across the white landscape. It was as if the night had never happened. But it had. And that wasn't the end. In the days that followed, we went about our Christmas celebrations. But the house didn't feel the same. The warmth of the fire couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in our hearts. Every night, as we lay in bed, we heard strange noises, scraping sounds from the attic, the soft shuffle of footsteps across the floor. But when we checked, no one was there. It wasn't until weeks later that I understood what had really happened. I overheard my mother talking to the village postman, a man who had been there longer than anyone. He had lived through the good years and the bad ones, through the floods and the fires. And he knew things about the village that no one else would speak of. "Do you know about the old man who lived in that house before?" he asked my mother in a hushed voice. "The one who always dressed like Santa?" My mother nodded, her face pale. "Yes, but what about him? He was no saint, that one. They say he was a hermit, a loner. He used to come to town on Christmas Eve, bringing toys to the children, but not in a kind way. They say he was cursed, a man who had made some terrible bargains in his past." "What kind of bargains?" "Some say he sold his soul to the devil. Others say he was trying to outrun something dark. But the thing about him was, he didn't stop on Christmas Eve. No, he never left, not even after he died." That's when it hit me. The man we saw that night, the one in the Santa suit, wasn't just a man. He was a spirit, a ghost, bound to the house, to the village, to the cursed land itself. And every year, on Christmas Eve, he would return, watching, waiting, for the children. We never stayed in that house again. Story number 4. The Haunted House of Santa Claus. 1965. It was the winter of 1965, the year my life changed forever. I was just a child back then, too young to understand the terror that would haunt our family for years to come. But as I sit here now, in the quiet of my late 40s, I can still hear the echoes, the creaks of old floorboards, the soft rustling of unseen footsteps in the night, and the chilling sound of a man's laugh, a laugh that no one was ever meant to hear. It started with the house. My parents had always dreamed of owning a grand old home, a place with history, something we could restore and fill with memories. We found the perfect one, a rambling Victorian house tucked away on the outskirts of a small town in Maine. The house had all the charm you'd expect: towering windows, a grand staircase that twisted upward like a serpent, and a sprawling attic full of forgotten treasures. It was the kind of place that called to you, as if it had been waiting for someone to come along and breathe life back into it. We bought it right before Christmas. I remember the day we moved in, how the snow seemed to fall in slow motion, blanketing the world in a soft, muted silence. It felt like the house was alive, like it had its own heartbeat, its own breath. We were excited. Of course, what better way to start a new chapter than in a house like this? decorated with twinkling lights and the scent of pine filling every room. But that excitement didn't last long. It wasn't until we began unpacking and settling in that we started noticing things, odd things, little things that didn't make sense. I remember one night, my sister Lily and I were sitting in the living room, waiting for our parents to finish decorating the tree. The house was unusually quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then, I heard it, the faintest creak from above, like the sound of footsteps crossing the attic floor. At first, I thought it was just the old house settling, the way old houses do. But then the footsteps came again, closer, and then, from the dark corner of the room, I saw something move. A shadow. No, not a shadow. A figure. It was tall. Too tall to be human. I blinked, and it was gone. I turned to Lily, but she hadn't seen anything. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light or the shadows. But I knew deep down that something wasn't right. There was something about this house that felt wrong, and I wasn't the only one who felt it. Over the next few days, the strange events multiplied. Doors that were locked in the morning were found wide open by nightfall. We'd hear the soft rustle of furniture being moved in the dead of night. But when we'd check, everything would be exactly where we'd left it. The kitchen, once silent, began to fill with the sound of dishes clattering, as if someone was preparing a meal we couldn't see. My father, practical man, was the first to dismiss it as the quirks of an old house. But my mother's unease grew with each passing day. It wasn't long before we heard the story. It was the neighbor, Mrs. Dawes, who told us. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes flicking nervously toward our house, like she was afraid it might be listening. She told us that the house had once belonged to a man named Elias Winterbottom, a reclusive figure who had moved to the town in the early 1900s. He was an eccentric, a man who claimed to be Santa Claus himself, not in the jolly, bearded way we all know, but in a twisted, darker sense. He believed that he was the real Santa, that his home was the place where Christmas magic was born, where the spirit of the holiday would manifest itself in ways no one else could comprehend. But Winterbottom's Christmas cheer had a dark side. He had no family, no friends, and no visitors. No one knew where he came from or why he lived so isolated. But Mrs. Dawes swore that she had seen him standing at the window on Christmas Eve, staring out into the snowstorm with empty eyes. The man had been a mystery to the town, and when he died in that very house, there was no one to mourn him, no one except the house itself, they said. And that's when the strange things began. Mrs. Dawes told us that the man's ghost had never left, that every year on Christmas Eve, his spirit would return to the house. His presence would fill the rooms like an oppressive weight, and the house would come alive again with strange noises and shadows. And most chilling of all, she claimed, was the laughter, the low, grating laugh of a man who never seemed to stop. At first, I didn't believe her, but then, things started to escalate. One night, just days before Christmas, I was woken up by the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside my room. I lay there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps came closer, and then, from beneath my door, I saw a shadow slip by, a long, dark figure moving with purpose. My breath hitched in my throat, and I mustered the courage to open the door. There, at the end of the hall, stood a man dressed in a tattered red suit, his beard matted with age and his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He looked at me, his smile wide and cruel, and for a moment, I thought I saw his eyes flicker with something that made my blood run cold. He didn't speak. He just stood there, motionless, until the sound of my father's footsteps down the stairs broke the silence. The figure vanished before my eyes, melting into the shadows like a phantom. That was the first night I knew we were not alone in that house. And I wasn't the only one who knew it. My parents started seeing him, too, usually at night, always when the house was still. When the clock struck midnight, it became impossible to ignore the strange, ominous feeling that hung in the air. like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My mother, unable to bear the stress, called in a series of spiritualists, priests, mediums, and even a local witch, but none of them could help. The spirits of the house wouldn't leave. They couldn't be driven away. The windows would still open on their own. The chairs would still shift. And the footsteps, oh God, the footsteps would echo in the halls. A reminder that we were never truly alone. And then came Christmas Eve. We were decorating the tree. Our last Christmas in the house. Or so we thought. The air was thick with the sense that something was about to happen. Something terrible. I caught a glimpse of the figure again, standing at the window, just as Mrs. Dawes had described. I watched him, my heart sinking, as his cold, dead eyes locked with mine. He smiled. It was then that we made the decision. We packed up our things, left the decorations half-hung, and walked away from the house. Forever. The house still stands to this day, abandoned, just as it was when we left. The windows are dark. The front door swings open on its hinges. And every Christmas Eve, if you stand quietly outside, you can hear it, the sound of footsteps, the low, gravelly laugh of Elias Winterbottom. And I can still hear his voice, whispering on the wind. Ho, ho, ho. Story number 5. The Haunted Christmas Ride. It was the winter of 1983 when I learned that there are some things better left unseen. Some things that refuse to stay buried in the past, no matter how much you wish they would. Back then, I was just a boy, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Every detail burned into my memory, like the smell of winter air before a storm, or the sound of heavy snow crunching underfoot. That Christmas Eve changed everything for my family. And what should have been a joyful celebration turned into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. We were living in a small, rural town in upstate New York, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. It was the kind of town where the snowflakes fell in thick, heavy clumps, and the cold made everything feel like it was suspended in time. My parents, my younger sister, and I had planned for a quiet Christmas Eve. We had a nice fire going in the fireplace, the tree sparkling in the corner with its tangle of lights, and the smell of fresh-baked cookies hanging in the air. It should have been perfect. It should have been a memory we'd cherish forever. But that night, something went horribly wrong. It started with an ad we had seen in the local paper, a holiday special. A Santa Claus chauffeur service, guaranteed to bring a personalized visit from Santa right to your front door. It sounded ridiculous. Of course, we knew it was just a gimmick. But after a few too many glasses of eggnog and with my little sister begging us to do something special, my parents relented. We placed the call. The company, Santa's Rides, promised the real deal. A jolly old man in a red suit who would spread holiday cheer to our doorstep. And it wasn't long before the scheduled night arrived. At exactly 8 o'clock, we heard the rumble of an engine down the road. It wasn't quite like the sound of a car, though. It was too rough, too uneven, almost like a truck that hadn't been properly maintained. It sputtered, backfired, and coughed as it drew closer. I remember my parents exchanging uneasy glances, but my sister was thrilled. She had never been more excited in her life. She practically danced with joy, her face lighting up like a beacon. The doorbell rang, and the moment I opened the door, I knew something wasn't right. There, standing under the porch light, was a man dressed in a Santa suit. But he wasn't quite what I had imagined. His eyes were too pale, his skin too sallow, his hair thin and brittle beneath his red hat. He wore the suit like it didn't quite fit, the fabric sagging in odd places, and his boots were cracked and worn, as though they'd seen far too many miles of rough terrain. Ho, 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 he said, but the cheerfulness in his voice sounded hollow, almost rehearsed. I looked over my shoulder to check on my parents. They didn't seem to notice anything off. My mother smiled warmly, welcoming him into the house, and my father, who had always been the cautious one, offered him a drink. But I could see it in his eyes, the same unease I felt. My gut told me that something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It was just a bad feeling, a creeping sense that we shouldn't be entertaining this stranger. He didn't stay long. After only a few minutes of forced small talk, he abruptly stood up and began to gather his things. "Santa's on his way to the next stop," he said in a strange, hollow voice. There was no ho 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 this time, just that flat tone, as if it wasn't him speaking, but something else, something not quite human. As he stepped out into the cold, I felt a chill sweep through the room, colder than any winter draft. He didn't turn back to wave goodbye, didn't even nod in acknowledgement. He simply walked out into the darkened night, disappearing into the thick snow, the sound of his footsteps gradually fading as he moved away. I remember standing in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't understand why, but I knew that this wasn't over. The next morning, Christmas Day, we woke to a terrible surprise. News reports flooded in that morning, carrying the tragic news of a local man, a truck driver named Tim Jacobs, who had been found dead in the woods near our town. His body was discovered just outside the small forest that bordered our property. The news was shocking, but what really struck me were the details of the discovery. Tim's body had been brutally mutilated. His throat had been slashed, and his body had been left in a twisted position that suggested he had been dragged across the snow. The police couldn't make sense of it. There were no signs of struggle, no clues pointing to who had done this. But the worst part? His truck was missing. Tim's truck, the one that was supposed to have delivered Santa Claus to our home the previous night, was nowhere to be found. The authorities investigated the area for days, but found no trace of the vehicle, and no one had any idea where it had gone. The only thing they could find was the set of tire tracks leading away from the woods, deep into the forest. It didn't take long for the rumors to start. People in town whispered about the Santa Claus chauffeur, some saying he was a ghost, others saying he was part of some twisted criminal operation. Some believed he had killed Tim to cover up some greater crime. Others, more superstitious, said that the man who had visited us wasn't Santa at all, but something far darker, something that wore the guise of jolly old Saint Nick to hide its true nature. My family never saw the man in the Santa suit again, but every year, when Christmas rolled around, I could feel the chill return to my bones, that same unsettling feeling creeping over me like the shadows of the winter night. People spoke of sightings, others who claimed to have seen the same man, wandering the roads late at night, his sleigh mysteriously absent, his eyes burning like coals in the dark. And then there was the call. A week after the incident, we received a phone call that chilled me to the core. The voice on the other end was muffled, distorted, and deep, as if it was being spoken through a heavy fog. "Ho ho ho," the voice said, and then it hung up. The case of Tim Jacobs' murder was never solved, and the mystery of the Santa chauffeur remained unsolved, buried in the snow with the rest of the town's darkest secrets. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and I know that the man in the Santa suit wasn't just a man. He wasn't even human. That Christmas, when the snow fell heavy once more, I locked my doors and told my family never to let anyone in without question. Because sometimes, the gifts we receive are not the ones we want, and sometimes, they are the ones that haunt us forever. Story number 6. The Man in the Santa Suit. It was the winter of 1948, a time when the world was still reeling from the scars of war. But the little town of Maplewood in northern Canada seemed untouched by the darkness that had gripped so much of the world. Christmas was just around the corner, and for the Fisher family, like so many others, it was a time of hope and joy. My family, like most, had learned to appreciate the small things: a hot meal, a warm home, and the company of loved ones. But we could never have prepared for what would come knocking at our door that night. I was only 13 at the time, but I remember it as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. I was sitting with my younger brother by the fireplace, the crackling flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The scent of pine from our Christmas tree filled the room, and outside, The snow had begun to fall in thick, heavy flakes. It was the kind of night that makes you feel safe, like the whole world was wrapped in a blanket of white. My parents were busy in the kitchen, preparing our Christmas dinner. The sound of my mother humming to herself mixing with the low murmur of my father's voice as he worked. We hadn't expected any visitors. We never did. Maplewood was small, remote, and aside from the occasional wanderer who passed through, no one ever came this far north. But then, as the clock struck 9, there came a knock at the door. It was a soft, polite tap, the kind you expect from a neighbor, but it was late, too late for anyone to be calling on Christmas Eve, and especially in a town like ours, where nobody was in a hurry to leave the warmth of their homes. My father looked at my mother, a brief flicker of suspicion in his eyes. He stood and walked toward the door, wiping his hands on his apron. "I'll see who it is," he said, his voice calm, but I could hear the edge of unease in it. I sat frozen in place, not knowing why, just knowing that something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. My brother, still young enough to believe in magic, had his eyes wide, expecting the usual Christmas cheer, but I felt a knot in my stomach, an unshakable sense that the night was about to take a dark turn. I'll never forget the moment the door creaked open. Standing on the doorstep was a man dressed in a tattered Santa suit. The bright red of his coat had dulled over time, the white trim soiled and frayed. His face was hidden beneath a thick, unkempt beard, and his eyes, those eyes were dark, too dark, like the pits of some ancient well, staring right into my soul. There was something wrong about him, something that made my skin crawl. But my father, ever the good man, didn't hesitate. He smiled and extended his hand, inviting the stranger in. "Merry Christmas," my father said, though his voice was tight, strained. The man nodded slowly, but didn't speak. His breath came in shallow, rasping gasps, like he was winded from some long journey. He stepped into the house, his boots leaving wet prints on the floor, but he didn't seem to care, or even notice, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. "Can I offer you some coffee?" my mother asked, her voice warm and welcoming, though there was a nervous edge to it now. The man didn't respond right away. He just stood there, looking at the Christmas tree, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he turned and fixed his eyes on me. The moment our gazes locked, I felt the blood drain from my face. His gaze was like a vice, cold and unfeeling. He stepped closer, and I could feel the chill radiating off him, even though the house was warm. "Your father," the man suddenly said, his voice a low rasp. "Is he the man who killed Henry Lawson?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My father's face went pale, and he took a step back, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "I know. No. That's..." But the man wasn't listening. His eyes bored into my father, and there was something about his expression now. Something hungry, something predatory. "Liar," he hissed, his voice taking on a terrifying edge. "You're the one, aren't you? You're the one who made him disappear." Before my father could respond, the man reached inside his jacket, and I saw the glint of something metallic. My heart stopped. It was a knife. My father's face went white, and he moved quickly, pushing my mother and brother back into the kitchen. Out of the line of sight, I was frozen, unable to move. My eyes locked on the man as he raised the knife in his hand. But before anything could happen, the man lowered the blade and turned toward the door. "Your family doesn't belong here," he muttered, his voice filled with malice. "This house is mine. It always has been." And just like that, he was gone, out the door, into the night, leaving nothing behind but the stench of his presence. We didn't know who he was. We didn't know what he wanted. But we did know that something dark had come to our house, and it wasn't finished yet. The police arrived shortly after, summoned by the neighbors who had heard the commotion, but they found no trace of the man, no footprints in the snow, no sign of him anywhere. They tried to reassure us. But I could see it in their eyes, they didn't know what to make of it either. Over the next few days, rumors spread through the town. People whispered about a man who had escaped from the local prison. A man who had been imprisoned for a string of violent crimes. It was said he had broken out on Christmas Eve, using a stolen Santa suit to cover his escape. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the man had known about my father. He had known something that we hadn't. Something about Henry Lawson, a man who had gone missing years before. His disappearance never solved. A man whose ghost seemed to haunt this place in ways that no one could explain. That night, when I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of him. The man in the Santa suit had come to our house for a reason, and I knew deep down that he'd be back. No one in Maplewood had seen the man again, but there were always stories, always rumors, and every Christmas, just as the snow began to fall, I'd hear someone at the door. A knock, soft at first, then louder. Ho ho ho. The voice would call out from behind the door, but when we opened it, there was nothing there, only the cold, and the echoes of that man's laughter. Story number 7. The Imposter Santa. It was a cold night in December of 1976. The kind of night where the world seems to hold its breath. Just before the first snow begins to fall, the air had that bitter, sharp quality to it, like the world was frozen in time. I'll never forget that night, or the way the wind howled through the trees outside, rattling the windows like a warning. It was the night Christmas became something else entirely. Something dark. I was only a kid back then, just 8 years old. My brothers and I were piled on the living room couch, our heads filled with the excited chatter about presents, Santa, and everything that comes with the magic of Christmas. It was the kind of excitement only children can feel, the belief that anything was possible, that the night would bring something magical, something wondrous. I can still remember the warm glow of the fireplace and the faint smell of pine from the Christmas tree. But that night, everything changed. It started when my parents told us to go to bed early. There were no complaints. We were used to it. They always insisted we get to sleep before midnight so we could wake up to a house filled with presents and the sound of reindeer hooves on the roof. But that night, I stayed awake longer than I should have. I don't know why. Maybe I felt something was off. Some inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling when I heard a faint noise, a scratching sound, like something or someone was moving in the house. It wasn't the wind or the house settling. This was deliberate, and it was coming from downstairs. I listened harder, my heart beginning to race. Then came the voice. It was soft at first, but it was unmistakable. A deep, gruff voice that sounded strangely familiar. Ho ho ho! It chuckled, as if mocking the real thing, the Santa we all thought we knew. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind again, maybe the creaking of the house in the cold. But it was too real, too close. I grabbed the edge of my blanket, clutching it tightly as I heard footsteps downstairs. Heavy, deliberate, the kind of sound you only make when you're walking with purpose. And it wasn't my parents. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't get out of bed. No, I stayed there, frozen in place, listening to the sounds below. I heard the clink of metal, the scrape of a chair against the floor, the unmistakable sound of something or someone going through the kitchen. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. I waited, my breath held in my chest, the darkness of the room pressing in on me like a living thing. And then, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. I heard him before I saw him. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like something out of a nightmare. The door to my bedroom creaked open, just a crack, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure dressed in the red suit. But there was something wrong about him, something off. The jolly figure I had imagined as a child, the warm, laughing Santa Claus, was gone. This man, or whatever he was, had a look in his eyes that made my skin crawl. His eyes were too wide, too bright, and they glistened in the dim light. He wasn't smiling. Not like Santa. His grin was something else, twisted, predatory, as if he knew something I didn't. He wore the traditional red and white, but the fabric of his suit was torn in places. And there were stains on the fabric. Dark stains. I couldn't tell if they were just the shadows of the night or something more sinister. He stepped closer. I stayed still, trying to breathe without making a sound. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. "Where are your parents, little one?" he asked. His voice a low, guttural growl. It didn't sound like Santa. It didn't sound like anything human. I didn't answer. What could I say? For what felt like an eternity, he stood there, staring at me. His gaze was almost hypnotic. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear, but I heard him sniff the air as if searching for something. Someone. Suddenly, I heard a muffled scream from downstairs. My heart froze. It was my mother. I bolted upright in bed, too terrified to even think straight. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever was downstairs wasn't Santa Claus. It was something far worse. The next moments blurred together. I didn't think. I didn't question. I jumped out of bed, ran down the hallway, and bolted down the stairs, my feet pounding on the wooden floors. I reached the living room and stopped dead in my tracks. My mother and father were lying on the floor, unconscious. Blood stained the carpet, and standing over them, the man in the Santa suit. No. The thing was rifling through the drawers, taking whatever he could find. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't obey me. I could barely breathe. It was then that he looked up at me. His eyes widened in a sickeningly satisfied way. "Good. You're awake," he said, his voice now a whisper full of venom. "I've got a special gift for you." He reached into the bag slung over his shoulder, pulling out a shiny knife. The blade gleamed in the dim light, and I could see every reflection of my terrified face in it. But before he could take another step, a sound, something I'll never forget, pierced the air. A sharp, shrill siren, the sound of a police car. The thing's eyes flashed with panic, and he dropped the knife. His form seemed to distort, flickering for a second, like a shadow under too much light. With a guttural snarl, he turned and bolted out the front door, disappearing into the night. The police arrived just seconds later, but by the time they searched the area, there was no sign of the man or whatever he was. The police called it a robbery gone wrong, but we all knew better. The thing in the Santa suit had been after something more than just money. It was after fear, after power. It had come for my family, and it had come for me. In the weeks that followed, the town settled into an uneasy calm, but every Christmas since, I can't shake the feeling that someone, is still out there, watching from the shadows, waiting for the next Christmas to arrive. And every year, when the wind howls through the trees, I still hear the voice of that man, or whatever he was, whispering in the back of my mind, "Ho, ho, ho! I'm coming for you."